Yo, what is going on, everyone? My name is Nick, or The Notorious Fantasy, and in today's video, we're going to be going in depth into my week number 10 wide receiver rankings and tiers for the 2022 fantasy football season. But before we can get on into things, I would like to ask that if you guys are new to the channel and you do end up enjoying today's video, that you please make sure to hit that subscribe button down below, as well as hitting that like button. It would help me out a ton. If you want to follow me on Twitter, please do so at NotoriousFNTSY. And if you have any questions about week number 10, please ask down below in the comment section or in the Discord linked in the video description. And in the pinned comment, we'll be talking about our sponsor of today's video, DraftKings, a little bit later. So without further ado, let's get on in to my week number 10 wide receiver rankings and tiers. We begin with tier number 1 at the wide receiver position. All 4 of these wide receivers are must-starts in my opinion. Headlined at number 1 with Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins going up against the Cleveland Browns. In his last 2 games, he's been a top 4 wide receiver in both matchups in half PPR, and he's currently the wide receiver number 1 on the season. This matchup up against the Cleveland Browns on paper isn't as ideal as the Chicago Bears or the Detroit Lions in his last 2 games, but ultimately, Tyreek Hill is so fucking good, and Tua Tagovailoa is playing at such a high level that ultimately, even if the matchup isn't as amazing as the last 2 games, I still think Tyreek Hill smashes in this spot. At number 2, we have Cooper Kupp of the LA Rams going up against the Arizona Cardinals at home in LA. In his last 2 games, he's been a top 10 wide receiver in both showings, and he has only fallen outside of the top 10 at the wide receiver position twice this year. I know Matthew Stafford is very unlikely to play in this spot, but even with John Wolford under center, the offense is so heavily designed towards force-feeding the rock down the throat of Cooper Kupp that I am so confident, even with John Wolford under center, that Cooper Kupp is still the wide receiver number 2 on the week. He's the wide receiver number 2 on the season. If you want to be a little safe and rank him as wide receiver 4, you can do you, but at the end of the day, you're still fucking starting Cooper Kupp this week, even with a backup quarterback. At number 3, we have Justin Jefferson, the king of the gritty of the Minnesota Vikings, going up against the Buffalo Bills in Buffalo. Even with the Buffalo Bills having Case Keenum under center, I'm still very confident that the Buffalo Bills are going to be able to put up a high point total, causing the Minnesota Vikings to have to be throwing the ball deep on into the game. Justin Jefferson is currently the wide receiver number 4 on the season, and he has had some worse games when compared to Tyreek Hill or Cooper Kupp. He's at a game where he's the wide receiver 85 and the wide receiver 47, but at the end of the day, there's a reason why you drafted Justin Jefferson so highly in the first round this summer. It's because the guy is fucking incredible. Kirk Cousins has looked great. This game is not in prime time. If it was in prime time, typically, then we get a bad spot out of Kirk Cousins, but it's at 1 Kirk Cousins time, so I like Justin Jefferson in this spot. At number 4, we have A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles going up against the Washington Commanders at home in Philly on Monday Night Football. Back-to-back games inside the top 14 at the wide receiver position, wide receiver 7. Last week, the Washington Commanders defense has gotten a little bit better. Typically, around halfway into the season, the Commanders defense starts to really wake up, at least as of recently, and that has already happened. But at the end of the day, the Philadelphia Eagles have what might be the best offense in the NFL, and I fully believe that A.J. Brown is going to be dominant in this performance, so he is a top 4 wide receiver for me. Now we move to tier number 2 at the wide receiver position. While there is a slight break between the two, a little bit of a gap, these guys are all must-starts in my opinion as well. At number 5, we have Stefon Diggs of the Buffalo Bills going up against the Minnesota Vikings, as I talked about with Justin Jefferson, even though we are more than likely going to be seeing Case Keenum under center on Sunday. Now, that hasn't been said yet, so maybe, just maybe, Josh Allen plays, but I think it's going to end up being Case Keenum. I am still fine being confident in Stefon Diggs because Case Keenum and Stefon Diggs have that connection from back in Minnesota, so it's a double revenge game. Diggs and Keenum up against the Minnesota Vikings. Last week, wide receiver 19 in a bad performance up against the Jets. They lost that game, but even in a loss, 10 targets, 5 receptions, 93 receiving yards. Currently the wide receiver number 3 on the season. The Vikings defense is pretty okay. I wouldn't say it's amazing. I wouldn't say it's awful. So even with Case Keenum under center, I still think Stefon Diggs is able to be successful for fantasy football. At number 6, we have Devontae Adams of the Las Vegas Raiders going up against the Indianapolis Colts at home in Viva Las Vegas. Last week, despite the fact that the Las Vegas Raiders offense fell off the edge of the fucking earth in the second half of the game up against the Jaguars, this motherfucker had 10 receptions on 17 targets for 146 receiving yards and not 1, but 2 touchdowns in that game. This week up against the Colts that are down astronomical. And that's not to say the Raiders aren't also down astronomical, right? The Raiders are down bad as well. I like this spot a ton for Davante Adams. He's had some really down games. Week 8, he was the wide receiver 97 in all of fantasy football. I know people are hard on Derek Carr. He hasn't been great this season, but ultimately, you're still firing up Davante Adams with confidence. At number 7, we have D-Hop, DeAndre Hopkins of the Arizona Cardinals going up against the LA Rams in LA. Both of these teams are kind of in dismay right now, if I'm being honest with you, and Kyler will be playing more than likely with a hamstring injury. Last week was DeAndre Hopkins' worst game thus far this season. He was wide receiver 10 in week 7, wide receiver 2 in week 8 up against the Vikings. Last week in a very positive matchup up against the Seahawks, wide receiver 25 targets, 4 receptions, 36 receiving yards, and a tug 12 fantasy points in that game. I understand the matchup up against the Rams isn't necessarily the best going up against Jalen Ramsey, but at the end of the day, DeAndre Hopkins is just so good that you have to keep him ranked inside the top 10. At number 8, we have my boy, Jalen waddled away, waddle, waddle. Jalen waddled away, waddle, waddle. Till the very next day, bump, 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 bada, bum. Wide receiver of the Miami Dolphins, back-to-back games as a top 6 wide receiver. Tyreek Hill is the number 1 receiver in fantasy football, and Jalen Waddle is wide receiver 5. Last week, wide receiver 6. Week 8, up against Detroit, wide receiver 3. He has scored 3 total touchdowns in the last 2 games and has had over 7 targets in both contests. Again, I am not under the belief that the Cleveland Browns defense is straight up dog shit, but at the end of the day, this offense in Miami looks so good. Jalen Waddle is the true 1B to Tyreek Hill's 1A. Until they prove me differently, I'm just going to have to keep ranking Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill as top 10 guys. They have a bye next week. After that, they play the Texans. They might be wide receiver 1 and 2 on the week up against the Texans defense. Next up, we move to wide receiver number 9, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions, going up against the Chicago Bears in Chicago. Since coming back from injury, Amon-Ra St. Brown hasn't necessarily been the same guy he was through the first 2 weeks of the season, wide receiver 14 and wide receiver 3. He's had back-to-back games as the wide receiver 29 and is currently the wide receiver 29 on the season. But at the end of the day, this matchup is great up against the Lions. This should be a very high-scoring tit-for-tat, back-and-forth affair, and I think Amon-Ra St. Brown gets back on the saddle and has a great game. At number 10 to close out the top 10 and tier number 2 at the wide receiver position, we have CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys going up against the Green Bay Packers in Green Bay. The Packers, both offense and defense, is down astronomical with a ass load of injuries. CeeDee Lamb coming out the bye with Dak Prescott. His last game up against the Bears, he was the wide receiver 12 in half PPR, scoring a touchdown, having 77 yards in that spot as well. CeeDee Lamb has been kind of up and down all year long, but that's really just because the fact that Dak got hurt. With Dak under center, I'm always going to be comfortable ranking CeeDee Lamb as a top 10 option. Now we move to tier number 3 at the wide receiver position, headlined by number 11, Juju Smith-Schuster, Mr. Corvette of the Kansas City Chiefs, going up against the Jacksonville Jaguars. In his last 3 games, this man has been on a roll, and we have to start, as a fantasy football community as a whole, putting more respect on Juju's name. I was someone who was a big advocate of doing the full Michael Jordan fade away on Juju Smith-Schuster. I didn't want anything to do with him, and I was correct for the first bunch of games. Wide receiver 42, 87, 34, 43, and 65. For where people drafted Juju, that was incredibly bad. But recently, wide receiver 7, 4, and 15. This guy has been a key piece in the success of the Kansas City Chiefs. This week, they get the Jacksonville Jaguars defense, who is in basically a roller coaster ride to follow, both offensively and defensively. Defensively, though, which is what we're talking about here, the Jaguars defense in some games, they look like the old Saxonville Jaguars. In other games, they look like they have no fucking idea what they are doing. Juju has been on a roll, so I'm going to continue to believe that he's going to ride this roller coaster wave, and we are going to go ahead and go with Juju as a top 12 receiver on the week. At number 12, we have Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns going up against the Miami Dolphins in Miami. Now, according to Fantasy Pros, this is a bad matchup for Amari Cooper, but I don't believe that 1 second. I have Fantasy Pros pulled up because that's where my rankings are. They are on Fantasy Pros. So, the Dolphins matchup, the Dolphins defense just got carved up like the fucking Thanksgiving turkey by Justin Fields. They are severely down bad with a bunch of injuries. This is a revenge game for Mr. Jacoby Brissett. Amari Cooper last time out was the wide receiver 6 in half PPR. I like this spot up against the Dolphins. He's a top 12 wide receiver right now in fantasy football on the year. got to keep rolling out. Amari Cooper at number 13, we have Mike Evans. Now, despite the fact that Tom Brady has been a complete and utter unmitigated fucking disaster all season long, Mike Evans has actually been very solid for fantasy football and is still a top 12 wide receiver in fantasy football. This matchup is in Munich, Germany. The Seattle Seahawks defense has definitely looked better compared to the start of the season. This game's interesting because typically these overseas games are lower scoring, and same with the Bucs games recently. It's like the Bucs might win this game 12-3 or something like that, right? Just a really low scoring game. But ultimately, I'm still pretty confident in Mike Evans, so he is wide receiver number 13. Before we move to wide receiver number 14, I would like to give you guys a quick word from our friends and our sponsor over at DraftKings Sportsbook. They've been on your screen this whole entire time. If you're listening to the podcast, you obviously couldn't have seen that. So DraftKings has a great offer for you if you are a brand new user to DraftKings Sportsbook and you click on the link in the video description down below. If you deposit $5 and bet $5 on any pregame money line on any sport, could be the NHL, the NBA, the NFL, college football, anything, and if your bet wins, you will win $200 in free bets on DraftKings Sportsbook. So since your bet has to win to get the free bets, the $200 in free bets, I would suggest going with a college football game that you feel like is a lock. For me, I love Michigan this week. I think Michigan is going to win very easily. So you bet $5 on them. Once Michigan wins on Saturday, you get your $200 in free bets. So make sure you guys check that out. Link in the video description. It helps me out a ton, and it's also going to help you guys out a ton because sportsbooks don't just love handing out free money. And essentially, this kind of is free money as long as you get the game right. Obviously, anything could happen. Michigan might lose. But they are my suggestion for the week. At number 14, we have Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers in Pittsburgh. So this matchup is pretty interesting. It appears TJ Watt will be good to go on Sunday in this spot. Andy Dalton, not the best. I would prefer if Jameis was under center. But outside of a disaster game up against the Las Vegas Raiders, he's been a top 16 wide receiver in 4 of the last 6 games. So in those games, week 3 against Carolina, wide receiver 6, then wide receiver 16, wide receiver 16 again, then he didn't play against the Bengals, wide receiver 14, 48, and 22. He's currently the wide receiver 16 on the season, and I bring up TJ Watt not because TJ Watt's a corner, but because TJ Watt is very impactful towards this defense. When TJ Watt is there, the defense just plays so much better. Even with that said, though, I still think Olave gets enough targets to where he'll be decent in this spot. At number 15, we have Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers logs his second full practice on Thursday. My assumption is that he plays on Sunday up against the LA Chargers on Sunday Night Football. I'm not trying to, insult Deebo Samuel's play this year, but let's be honest with you, Deebo, based upon where you drafted him, has been a bust. He's only been a top 10 receiver once this year. So even ranking him at wide receiver 15 feels kind of high for me. Last good game was in week 4 against the other LA team, the Rams, where he's wide receiver 5. He only has 3 touchdowns on the year. The Chargers defense isn't good, so I think Deebo will have a good spot, but McCaffrey joining them does concern me a little bit. I mean, I'm still going to keep ranking Deebo high, but just understand that at this point, my confidence in Deebo isn't very high. At number 16, we have DK Metcalf, wide receiver of the Seattle Seahawks, going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Tampa Bay. But Nick, I think Lockett's better. Okay, if you want to flip-flop fucking 69 DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, do that if you want. Not going to judge you. DK Metcalf going up against the Buccaneers back-to-back games as a top 18 wide receiver. The Bucs defense does look better, but Geno Smith has been cooking things up. Chef Geno cooking it up, not like Russell Wilson is in Denver. Again, the matchup isn't the best. I think this might be a lower scoring game, but I'm not going to let some stupid fucking bias of, these games are always lower scoring overseas. I think ultimately DK has a pretty solid showing. Now we move to tier number 4 at the wide receiver position, headlined by Allen Lazard of the Green Bay Packers going up against the Dallas Cowboys. He was limited in practice yesterday on Thursday, limited participant in practice with that shoulder injury. I assume he plays because the wide receiver core in Green Bay is severely injured. Last week up against the Lions, despite a dud of a game as a whole by the Green Bay Packers, he was wide receiver 8, 17 fantasy points in half PPR, 10 targets, 4 receptions, 87 receiving yards, and a touchdown. At a point in this season, Allen Lazard was really on a solid run from weeks 4 through 6, wide receivers 17, 21, and 10. I know the Cowboys defense isn't some pushover, and I know, not Allen Lazard, I know Aaron Rodgers, Mr. Discount Double Check, played like absolute hot fucking garbage last week, but ultimately, I still think Allen Lazard gets it done this week. At number 18, we have my guy Joshua Palmer, wide receiver 11 last week up against the Atlanta Falcons, 10 targets, 8 receptions, 106 receiving yards. In his last 2 games, 12 and 10 targets. This week, they have a tough matchup up against the San Francisco 49ers. More than likely, I would say basically a lock at this point. Keenan Allen doesn't play. They don't have Mike Williams. They need to throw the ball to someone. The 49ers offense is absolutely fucking ferocious. They are an incredible defense. I think that Joshua Palmer, though, is going to get a lot of targets because they're going to be down in the game. Justin Herbert, the pervert's got to throw it to someone, and that someone is Joshua Palmer. At number 19, we have Tyler Lockett in my pocket. Skirt of the Seattle Seahawks going up against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Wide receiver 21 in week 8, wide receiver 10 in week number 9. Currently, the wide receiver 10 in all of fantasy football. Again, Geno Smith's play this year has been incredible. I did not expect it at all. I hated Tyler Lockett in fantasy drafts because I was like, Geno Smith fucking sucks. They're probably going to go to horsecock Drew Lock at some point. This is a disaster. And even last year and the years prior, when DK Metcalf's feasting, Lockett's in the corner watching like a cuck in the corner. But this season, both Geno and DK can eat at the exact same time, or not Geno and DK, Lockett and DK can eat at the exact same time because of how good Geno Smith is playing. Again, I do have this negative mentality against these games overseas, but maybe shit's different in Germany, you know? Maybe it is. At number 20, we have Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars going up against the Kansas City Chiefs in Kansas City. The Jaguars are going to be down in this game, guaranteed. The Chiefs' offense is amazing. They're going to have to throw the ball deep in the game. Despite having some downward swings this season, Christian Kirk is the number 9 receiver in all fantasy football right now in half PPR. They're going to be down in this game. They're going to have to throw the ball late last week up against the Las Vegas Raiders in that comeback win. 9 targets, 8 receptions, 76 receiving yards, 1 touchdown, 18 fantasy points. Wide receiver number 5. I like this spot for Christian Kirk. It does seem like it might be a letdown game because Trevor Lawrence is so hit or miss and the run game is so good. But based upon what we saw last week, you can't rank Christian Kirk much lower than this, if I'm being honest with you. Again, he looked so good last week. Wide receiver 21 to close out tier number 4. We have F1 Scary Terry McLaurin. Had a down game last week with Heineke under center, though. It does really feel like Terry McLaurin is destined for much better games. I know Carson Wentz on paper might be a slightly better quarterback than Heineke, but Heineke will actually throw the ball deep. He'll do those crazy plays where he spins around as a 360 like he's in fucking FaZe Clan in Call of Duty, like he's Kyler Murray, throws the ball into triple coverage, and just lets McLaurin go and get the ball. He was wide receiver 27 last week, but before that with McLaurin, wide receiver, or with Heineke under center, wide receiver 20 and wide receiver 9. The matchup against the Eagles is definitely concerning. I will agree with that, right? The Eagles defense is amazing, but I still just feel like Heineke's going to throw the ball so much to McLaurin he's probably going to be a top 24 receiver. Now we move to tier number 5, wide receiver 22, Brandon Ayuk. I already addressed my concerns about this offense when we talked about Deebo, but Deebo's been down bad, and Ayuk's been pretty solid. Wide receiver 3, 24, and 10 over his last 3 contests. Currently wide receiver number 20 on the season. I honestly, crazy enough, while I have Ayuk ranked lower because I think his upside is slightly lower because of how good Deebo is, I almost feel more confident. Like if I had Deebo and Ayuk and I could only start one, while I have Deebo ranked higher, in terms of like peace of mind, I almost think Brandon Ayuk, crazy enough, might be safer at this point. The matchup's great against the Chargers. I just hope all of McCaffrey, Deebo, and Ayuk can eat all at the exact same time. At number 23, we have Chris Godwin of the Bucks going up against the Seahawks. Every single week, this man's getting a huge amount of targets. Week 6, 12 targets. Week 7, 13 targets. Week 8, 11 targets. Last week, 10 targets. Yet, he is yet to finish inside of the top 20 at the wide receiver position. Something's bound to change. Something's bound to change. It's like Deontay Johnson. You keep getting targets, but you keep underperforming. And the thing is, with Chris Godwin, I like Deontay Johnson, the player. I'm not trying to shit on his chest or something, but Chris Godwin, legitimately in my opinion, is a top 10 wide receiver talent in the NFL, but for some reason, things aren't just clicking this year. It's not clicking with the whole Bucs team, but at least with Evans, he's still putting up fantasy numbers. Now, Fantasy Pros expert consensus rankings have Chris Godwin as wide receiver 19. I got him at wide receiver 23, so I'm a little bit lower than consensus. And I feel like I almost want to rank him lower, but at the same time, once you get after Godwin, it's like, can you really go to sleep on Sunday and be like, fuck, why didn't I start Chris Godwin? Why did I start George Pickens over Chris Godwin and Chris Godwin outscores him, right? You don't want to be an idiot. You need that peace of mind as well. At number 24, we have Rondale Moore of the Arizona Cardinals going up against the LA Rams in LA. Back-to-back games inside the top 22 at the wide receiver position. He had one down game up against the Saints. I kind of started to get nervous about Rondale Moore, but ultimately, this guy is a weapon for the Arizona Cardinals until Hollywood Brown returns. I think Rondale Moore is a guy you need to consistently rank inside the top 24 at the wide receiver position. Obviously, the matchup up against the Rams isn't some mouth-watering matchup, right? It's not the best matchup on earth, but I still think Rondale Moore gets it done up against the LA Rams. At number 25, we have Devontae Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles going up against the Washington Commanders at home in Philly. Back-to-back games outside the top 50 at the wide receiver position. Devontae Smith is incredibly risky every single week because there are so many playmakers on the Eagles team. They have Goddard, they have A.J. Brown, they have Jalen Hurts, they have Miles Sanders, they have Devontae Smith. There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. Ultimately, there's going to be down games for Devontae Smith, but there's also going to be spike games where Devontae Smith puts your team on his fucking back like he's Dora, okay? Week 3 up against the Commanders, this motherfucker was the wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. Now, I'm not saying that he's going to repeat 12 targets, 8 receptions, 169 receiving yards, and a score. I'm not saying that is going to happen. But what I am telling you is that while he is risky, the upside alone makes it very hard to kind of rank Devontae Smith lower than where I have him. At 26, we have George Pickens. I'm incredibly high on George Pickens, Snoop Dogg style, in this game. I'm very high on him. They trade Chase Claypool. I know up against the Eagles, George Pickens scored a grand total of 0 points. But the week before that, he was wide receiver 11 up against the Dolphins, 6 of 6, 61 receiving yards, and a touchdown. The Saints defense is pretty decent. Maybe I'm too high on George Pickens, but ultimately, everything's adding up in my brain for Pickens to have a great game here. At number 27, we have MPJ, Michael Pittman Jr. of the Colts going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. Yikes, man. I really liked Michael Pittman Jr. I like the skill set of the player. Think he's an excellent player. But he has been outside of the top 32 every single game except for 2 weeks. The Raiders' defense sucks complete and utter donkey cock. So here's the spot for him. Will he take advantage of it, though? Don't think so. That's why he's in tier 6. Number 28, we have Jerry Jeudy of the Denver Broncos going up against the Le Titans in Tennessee. Wide receiver 19 and 14 in his last 2 go-outs games, I guess. I don't know. Goes at it. I think that's what I was trying to think of, but I don't even think that's the correct wording. His last 2 outings, wide receiver 19 and 14, wide receiver 34 in the season. He's looking good, but at the same time, can you trust Russell Wilson, Mr. Unlimited? I don't know. Wide receiver 29, Gabe Davis. Think Diggs will be fine without Keenum? Don't think Gabe Davis will be fine without Keenum. Gabe Davis relies on the deep ball, the deep strike from Josh Allen. He's been a disaster the last 2 games. His upside's really high. He's basically like Devontae Smith, except for now with a worse quarterback. Number 30, to close out the top 30, I ranked this guy a little high because I like him. Mac Hollins of the Raiders going up against the Indianapolis Colts. Team's without Waller. Team is without Hunter Renfrow, the king of grit. Seems like a good spot for Mac Hollins. He's had some boom spots this season against the Colts defense. I'm rocking with them. So thank you guys all so much for watching today's video. If you did end up enjoying, make sure you hit that subscribe button as well as that like button down below. If you want to hear some other wide receivers real quick that rank behind Mac Hollins, we got Deontay Johnson against the Saints, Darnell Mooney against the Lions, Adam Thielen against the Buffalo Bills, Sutton against the Titans, Curtis Samuel up against the Eagles in Philadelphia, Brandon Cooks if he plays up against the Giants, Mecole Hardman up against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Thank you guys all so much for watching today's video. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, leave it down below in the comment section. I also do like Mecole Hardman a decent amount, but he also is pretty hit or miss. Thank you guys all so much for watching. If you ended up enjoying, again, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button down below. Make sure you check out that DraftKings offer, that $5 on any pregame money line. If you're a new user, click on the link in the video description. You'll receive $200 in free bets if your bet wins. Thank you guys for watching. Love you guys all. Have a great rest of your guys' day. And as always, goodbye!